What is poppin' YouTube? Bringing you 5 buy low players for Dynasty Fantasy Football. I'm going to give you some buys for both contending and rebuilding teams. Starting it off with the first contending buy. It's going to be Tyreek Hill. And the thing is, with Tyreek Hill, we know this man's an absolute PPR machine. And we're looking at him on Keep Trade Cut. He is just continuing to fall month after month. And the biggest reason that he continues to fall is just due to that age. He is 30 years old and he's the wide receiver 13. I mean, honestly, I just put out my Dynasty rankings for my wide receivers about a week ago, and I talked about how Tyreek Hill should probably be in the top 8 wide receivers. He should probably be in the top 5 wide receivers in Dynasty. It's just that ageism that we play with, that cliff that we know is coming with any wide receiver, is getting up there. But when we're looking at his overall value over the last month, he's honestly lost about 1,000 points in Keep Trade Cut, and over the last 6 months, he's dropped down 7 spots in the Dynasty rankings. And I understand a lot of people are starting to get scared about Tyreek Hill in that age, but the last 2 years, 20.4 fantasy points, 23.5 fantasy points, he's been a top 3 points per game wide receiver. So there's really no reason for us to look at Tyreek Hill and say, hey, man, it's starting to fall off. Like the thing that we saw with Stephon Diggs last season at the end of the year, where he had a really star-on start to the season, then kind of fell off at the back end. We haven't seen that from Tyreek Hill. We've only seen very consistent numbers, even without Patrick Mahomes, actually better numbers without Patrick Mahomes. So for me, if I'm a contender and I'm trying to push the chips in, go try to see if you can go get some Tyreek Hill, because honestly, probably one of the biggest difference makers you can make, and the price is not going to be outrageous. We're talking about him in the same line of, can I give up Brandon Ayuk to go get Tyreek Hill to go make a championship run? Can I give up a Jalen Waddle to go get a Tyreek Hill? Can I even switch someone like a Romo Dunze for a Tyreek Hill if I need to win a championship? Like we said, we play in windows, and if you're in one of those windows where you have to push the chips in and go all in for a guy like Tyreek Hill, absolutely love the value on Tyreek Hill. Think he's an absolute buy low opportunity for you if you are contending. My next buy is going to be for the rebuilders. It's going to be Rashee Rice. And I understand I am a type of guy in Dynasty. I like to get some damaged goods, because when you're trying to get the damaged goods, the price is usually pretty affordable. And right now on Keep Trade Cut, Rashee Rice is all the way down at overall player 93, wide receiver 35. And let me say this about Rashee Rice. He is better than wide receiver 35. At his peak last year, he got up to wide receiver 14 at one point over the last 6 months. Wide receiver 14, he was almost a wide receiver 1. And then, of course, all these dumb decisions have then impacted his Dynasty value, where now we're looking at him as wide receiver 35. Now, he did get down to like the wide receiver 50, so his value is starting to rebound. But I think if Rashee Rice, if nothing had happened, if we were looking at him totally clean, we're talking about a top 16 wide receiver in Dynasty. And cool, maybe he gets suspended a few games this year. I understand we don't like to see those habits. We don't like to see those type of dumb decisions. But at some point, we have to pull ourselves from being really good people here in the Dynasty community. I know all y'all are really great people, and really look and say, hey, Rashee Rice can get me a ton of fantasy football points. And that is what we want added to our roster. When you're looking at yourself as a rebuilder, you need to get some value. You need guys that can go shooting up in value, because then you can either potentially trade them or you can potentially hold them. And a guy like Rashee Rice, who had 13.3 fantasy points per game, was the wide receiver 28, 102 targets, 79 receptions. We absolutely love that. And now I know a lot of people are going to say, well, Caleb, they drafted Xavier Worthy. They got Hollywood Brown. You still got Travis Kelce. My thing is, Hollywood Brown, Xavier Worthy are down the field targets. Rashee Rice and Travis Kelce are both there in the intermediate, shorter yard range. And we saw this elite level production. Just imagine having more targets where it was essentially only Rashee Rice as a wide receiver and Travis Kelce. Imagine adding 2 more weapons to create space for Rashee Rice. I absolutely love it. I think Patrick Mahomes gets back to a top 2 points per game quarterback this year. So absolutely love buying into Rashee Rice, especially as a rebuilder, because let's be clear, you can wait out a suspension if you are a rebuilder. And that is who I'm trying to target if I'm trying to buy as a rebuilder. My second buy for a contender is going to be Josh Jacobs. Now, I have been notorious for trying to really sell Josh Jacobs off my roster post free agency. When he was at RB10, I was just feeling a little bit not good about Josh Jacobs and that overall value, and was trying to say, hey, I think we might have to potentially be looking to sell. But over these last few months, he's actually dropped 4 spots down to RB15. I mean, he's behind Rachaad White, Isaiah Pacheco, James Cook. And especially if you're trying to contend, I mean, Josh Jacobs, we've seen him have a top 5 points per game finish over the last 2 years. And we're looking at him like, I understand, maybe I prefer Rachaad White, but Isaiah Pacheco and James Cook right now over Josh Jacobs, I don't know if I can get behind it. If I can flip Trey Benson for Josh Jacobs, which Trey Benson is sitting at RB16, that is a deal that I'm looking to do. continue because I just think Josh Jacobs in this Green Bay Packers offense, I understand they like to do an RB by committee, but you have A.J. Dillon, they drafted Lloyd. I don't feel super threatened by either of those guys with Josh Jacobs. And even last year, I know he finished an RB 18 in the points per game basis, but still had 233 rushing attempts, 805 yards. The biggest thing was that 3.5 yards per carry, but the only reason that he had that 3.5 yards per carry was because of how terrible that offense was. And back in 2022 and 2021, he had 50 total receptions in each of those seasons. Last year only had 37 in the 13 games that he played. So a lot of it was injury basis. A lot of it was just that offensive line, which was terrible for the Raiders last year. So I'm really buying into Josh Jacobs, especially if I need a running back to go make that championship push. I understand he got that contract, so really you can look at Josh Jacobs for the next 2 years. And honestly, we can only really project some of these running backs 2 years out anyways. So give me some Josh Jacobs as my second buy low for a contender. Moving on to my second buy low for a rebuilder, it's going to be Bryce Young. And Bryce Young, for some pre-draft process, he was kind of the clear quarterback one in last year's Dynasty quarterback class until Anthony Richardson had the amazing combine. Then it was kind of like, hey, Anthony Richardson debatably could be the 101 versus Bijan Robinson. Then, of course, we all should have known we should have been drafting CJ Stroud all along. Bryce Young got pushed down to QB2, QB3, depending on how people viewed CJ Stroud versus Bryce Young. And Bryce Young put up absolutely horrid stats last year. 10.4 fantasy points per game was the QB29, a 59.8% completion percentage, 5.5 yards per attempt, only had 253 rushing yards and 11 total passing touchdowns. It just wasn't good. And I understand that we in the Dynasty community really cannot evaluate quarterbacks. I think that's what I've learned. You kind of can only base it off of draft capital. Anything other than draft capital, come on. We can't really take it into consideration because as much as we can look at the film, a lot of these NFL teams are investing millions and millions of dollars into their quarterback decisions and they get it wrong all the time. So Bryce Young, as much as we think that the Carolina Panthers potentially got it wrong, I think there is still a great buy window because not only do the Carolina Panthers bring in Dave Canales, who had great success with both Geno Smith and Baker Mayfield, but we also have Deontay Johnson gets added to this offense as well as Xavier Legette. They continuously also add Jonathan Brooks. They improve and invest in the offensive line in free agency. So we're looking at a little bit better situation for Bryce Young compared to year one. Actually, a lot better situation for Bryce Young compared to year one. And his dynasty value, QB20, it has gone up just a little bit. But when we're looking at him, Bryce Young compared to like a JJ McCarthy, compared to like a Will Levis, I mean, I think you could argue JJ McCarthy over Bryce Young at this point just based on what we haven't seen from JJ McCarthy. But Bryce Young is in the same boat. Like, he should be ahead of Will Levis just based on the fact that Bryce Young was the first overall quarterback drafted. And I think there's a lot of room when you're looking, could I trade the 109 for Bryce Young? Like, that's kind of what it's looking like because he's right now next to like Xavier Worthy, Brian Thomas Jr., James Cook. If I can trade something like that in the range on a rebuilder, where especially in Superflex, quarterback is king. I don't care what you say. I know a lot of people say, hey, these high-end QB2s don't matter at all. But Bryce Young, I know he maybe never has top 5 overall points per game upside, top 5 dynasty quarterback upside. I think if he can still sneak in as a high-end QB2, which I think could be in his range of outcomes, I think we're looking at him as a great shot to be taking, especially if you're a rebuilder, on your dynasty roster. So absolutely love some Bryce Young as my second rebuilding buy. My third rebuilding buy for you contenders is going to be Calvin Ridley. And Calvin Ridley signs that big contract with the Tennessee Titans, but kind of gets thrown into the same category as like a guy like a Stephon Diggs or like a Mike Evans, or really gets put in the same category as Keenan Allen. And as much as I love Keenan Allen and the points per game advantage that he's given you over the last few years in Dynasty and in redraft, coming into this season with Caleb Williams, I am not hyped about Keenan Allen. But with Calvin Ridley, I'm super hyped because he is only competing with targets with DeAndre Hopkins and Chico Okonkwo. They signed Tony Pollard and Tyjae Spears in the backfield. So there could be the argument to be made that Calvin Ridley is the clear 1A based on the money that they spent on him in free agency. I know rumors with Callahan talking about how Calvin Ridley is going to take that Jamar Chase role that he had in the offense with the Cincinnati Bengals. He is 29 years old. So I understand the little bit concern about age as these wide receivers approach the age of 30, especially on contenders. We start to get a little bit worried. Are we just going to hold the bag and let the points per game kind of take hold? And that's what I'm doing here with Calvin Ridley, because even last year, 13.5 fantasy points per game, wide receiver 27, 14.2 the year before that when he only played 5 games in 2021, but 18 points back in 2020. And so the first year off that suspension, 13.5, it wasn't bad. It wasn't like Deshaun Watson where we didn't see anything kind of resembling him right out of the suspension. We saw some flashes from Calvin Ridley, had 136 targets in a Jacksonville Jaguars offense where he was competing with Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram. And now he kind of goes into a Tennessee Titans offense where I know DeAndre Hopkins is a big target hog, but he's really only competing with targets with DeAndre Hopkins. And we've seen Calvin Ridley be able to perform with a guy like Julio Jones. So absolutely love some Calvin Ridley, especially if you are a contender, because like we said, right now, wide receiver 49, going around guys like Matthew Stafford, Ramondre Stevenson, Jake Ferguson, Jalen Warren, Alvin Kamara. I need a wide receiver, especially if you're playing in a deeper 2 flex, 2 wide receivers, 3 wide receivers, 2 flex, and the wide receiver value is so high on a guy like Calvin Ridley, who he's being valued right now as a wide receiver 3, and you can get him and throw him in your wide receiver 3 flex spot. Absolutely love that value on Calvin Ridley right now, because I think he's going to be used appropriately, and that is why I'm targeting some Calvin Ridley if I am a contender. And my last buy, if you are a rebuilder, is going to be Tank Dell. And Tank Dell, if you're rebuilding, just feels like a good buy. And to be honest, I think Tank Dell, even into the season, is going to be a good buy, because the reason is he's going to be the clear wide receiver 3 on this Houston Texans offense. Whether you like him more than a guy like Stephon Diggs or Nico Collins or not, that's probably how he's going to be used. He's going to be used in the slot. And I know he put up wide receiver 18, 15 fantasy points per game this last year before he broke that fibula. But coming off that injury, also adding in Stephon Diggs, I don't know if that was really just for them to go all in, push their chips in with CJ Stroud while he's on that rookie contract, or if that was a little bit of hesitancy with the injury for Tank Dell. Now, Tank Dell, still very young, 24.5, will turn 25 this year. I don't think there's any concern for me with Tank Dell and his current wide receiver value when we're looking at him as wide receiver 20. And I think the value that he could potentially have, at his peak, he got up to wide receiver 12, wide receiver 11. And I think that's exactly where he's going to be headed back to, just based on the fact that we have Nico Collins in that last year of the deal. It's definitely a 1-year deal for Stephon Diggs. We could be talking in 2025 with Tank Dell being the clear wide receiver 1, or worst case scenario, being the clear wide receiver 2. I don't think there's any way that they're able to actually re-sign Stephon Diggs unless something crazy happens. And so for me, when I'm looking at Tank Dell, I think his value can only go up. And so when you're a rebuilder, you want a few things. You want young guys that can produce fantasy football points, and you want guys that can increase in value. And I think Tank Dell, even though he is wide receiver 20, it's not like a super cheap buy. I just think that value is going to increase in value as we look at ourselves next Dynasty offseason. So absolutely go try to trade for Tank Dell. Like we said, some players in the range of Tank Dell would be a guy like a Zay Flowers, a Jordan Addison. I think both those guys, if you could flip one of those guys into Tank Dell, absolutely love it. If I have a guy like DJ Moore and I can flip DJ Moore and I'm trying to rebuild, I know DJ Moore isn't necessarily old, but he's not necessarily young. Give me some Tank Dell and add him to my roster. So if you like Dynasty Fantasy Football, hit that like and subscribe button. I swear, the next 2 videos I'm putting out after this, I feel like I'm starting to get into my content grind as we approach June. Hope you had a good Memorial Day weekend. Appreciate you guys so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.